Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Sad. I've been a DevOps engineer in open learning at MIT for about 7, 8 years now. I do a bit of security, but it's not my main job, but it's definitely part of DevOps, so I focus on that. While and I have started teaching a course on Codeize this past May, I think. That was our first course run, and we're looking forward to having multiple runs. So we're hoping to see some of you there if you're interested, and we're looking forward to chatting today.
Hey, thanks. My name is Wael, and I've been in tech for about 20 years now, and with VMware for around 6. I started out as a network engineer and then got to focus on security full time. Yeah, this is a good segue into what we want to talk about. As Sarah said, we gave the first run of our course, which is really aimed at folks looking to enter the field, and the focus is on having a defensive security mindset versus an offensive one going to attack systems. There's obviously merits to both. We have some thoughts as to what people should start learning. And the course really does focus a lot on reasoning from first principles and focusing on basics, which I think is related to what we want to talk about today, which is AI. And clearly, not a day goes by where there isn't a new news story about some workflow that's about to be disrupted by AI or another opportunity for people to be substituted by a better AI, a more efficient AI workflow, and so on and so forth. Of course, as usual, there's some truth somewhere, but you have exaggerations, there's various motivations. And we're not here, obviously, to discuss AI specifically, but more from the standpoint of a security practitioner. Where does that leave you? Does that leave you in a better place or not? So let's talk a little bit about some of the things that are relevant. So as a security practitioner, you'll hear a lot about either products now magically having that AI pixie dust, that they're suddenly AI enabled. And it reminds me a little bit of the move to the cloud, right? You would have certain products and overnight they're cloud ready or cloud first or cloud whatever. And sometimes it was true that those products were written from the ground up to be used in the cloud. And sometimes it was just a shift and dump type of scheme, meaning it was an on-premise product and they just launched a few virtual machines and they called it a cloud product now. So there's going to be a little bit of both here. So one, like I said, is you might come across vendors that claim to use AI in their products, and you might need to do some due diligence to understand what it is that they're doing. On the other hand, the integration of AI-based workflows. So whether it's assisted coding, to image generation, to generation of text, and I do see a lot of people using large language models to do all sorts of things, including just creating copy. So what are I'd like us to go over some of the challenges that you'll encounter with these types of use cases. So do you have anything to add on just the quick tour I gave of the landscape there?
Yeah, I think the idea we're trying to drive as part of this is yes, AI is definitely a game changer. There's no doubt. And it's not just another tool and the hype is going to subside and then all of a sudden no one's really going to be talking about AI. It's here to stay. It's a game changer. But the trick is to figure out how does it impact cybersecurity work? Because there's, like Wael has been saying, there's a ton of hype. There's all this hype about, oh, it's going to replace humans. You don't need to be a cybersecurity engineer because AI tools are going to take over. And I think our idea is that there is no replacing understanding and still focusing on fundamentals and foundations of cybersecurity because you still need to know what to ask and where to ask it and how to ask it, even with AI around. And I think that's what we'll be covering for the next 20 minutes or so.
Yeah, so just thinking about something you said. Yeah, I think we have reached a tipping point in some ways in terms of what these tools can do. And a lot of the stuff has been around for decades, if you ask anyone deep in AI. But I think large language models and OpenAI's move with ChatGPT to make this interface so accessible has really brought that to the fore. Yes, some things may be hype, but I do think this is something that will stay. It's going to continue to get refined, and you have a lot of options. You have the closed source models, and then you have a lot of models that you can consume and train on your own. So, and a lot of enterprises are going down that route. They don't want to use a third-party service and push all of their data, which is a very good entry point to the next topic here, which is what are the security implications of using AI? And how do you think about it that way? Lots of folks jump to think about what the service is and what it's going to do for them and lose sight of the basics. Ultimately, let's say you are going to integrate it into your work, regardless of the service, whether it's a large language model, is something for assistive coding, or whatever it is, you can always think of it as just a dependency of yours, right? Something in your supply chain. Just like you rely on third-party software, say in the form of open source software, and you have to treat those dependencies with care. You want to think about it in that way. And that's where you go back to the basics, which is what problem am I trying to solve? How is this tool solving this problem for me? What am I required to do to make use of this tool? If I'm sending data, what data am I sending? What are the compliance regulations I'm under or that data is subject to? What is required of my engineers to use this? And then assume something goes wrong with this third-party entity. What's the possible impact? For example, if you're using something to help you write code, ask yourself things like, let's assume this is now a malicious entity. What could the impact be there? If you're using it to write, for example, let's just have an example. If you're using it to write marketing copy, right? And let's say this large language model goes haywire. The output you can actually look at and see, okay, this doesn't make sense. You're not just going to funnel that into your social media and then without due diligence. But if you're using it to generate code, and lots of it, and you're not maybe that advanced in your coding journey, and all you do is copy and dump that code in there. And I know some of you are thinking, oh, no, who does that? Lots of people do that. This precedes AI. The number of stories about companies getting hacked only then to find out that it was traced to a vulnerability in their code, which originated in a snippet of code that someone just copied and pasted from Stack Overflow, for example, right? So we know these things happen. That's why knowing what it is that you're doing and understand the impact of should something go wrong is one of the basics of a strong defensive posture. And
To
yeah, so
give you
yeah,
no, to give you an example, and this actually just happened today. We had one of our engineers had been testing GitHub Copilot. If you're not familiar, GitHub Copilot is an AI assistant to help you write code, like Wild was talking about. And so he was talking about all the features and all the stuff that how he's been using it and all that. And then the one question came up was, so how is it handling if you have any secrets open in your IDE? Because apparently what GitHub Copilot does to add context to it so that it can provide you really good examples, it actually takes snippets from your code from different tabs and not just the active tab. So if you have an environment file with some secrets there, that's getting pulled up and analyzed. Now there is, and so we started looking at some of the documentation, and some people complain because there is no clear documentation from GitHub on what actually the snippets they're pulling and how they operate. Are those being stored or do those get deleted? And so again, that goes back to basic principles of we should be asking, how does this whole thing work when we install an extension like that? How is it working? Not just blindly installing it because, hey, it's going to help us code better. That's nice, but we need to ask the right questions in that case. And the other thing too, regarding Copilot specifically, there's been a lot of research, latest research shows that because GitHub Copilot has been trained on a lot of the open source code, that generates a bunch of issues. One of them is that 40% of the code that it suggests has vulnerabilities in it because, again, it's trained on open source code. It's not best practices or anything. So depending garbage in, garbage out in a sense. So that's one thing to mind when you're taking those suggestions or recommendations from Copilot, among other legal issues that we'll probably discuss further.
Yeah, there's some implications beyond just security. Usually, licensing comes into play, and one of the issues today that LLMs are still facing is attribution and copyright, and I think we're far from resolving this. And that especially holds for models that are closed source, so you don't really know how they were trained and where the origin data comes from, and so the responses may include things that are copyrighted, for example. And I think that's happened. I don't know if it's a consortium of authors that have sued, or maybe, have you heard about this, Saad? I think it was Penguin. One of the publishers sued OpenAI for that because they had scanned a whole bunch of books. And of course, OpenAI, I think, has claimed that this stuff is in the public domain. Again, I'm not sure, but the point is, if you consume that stuff without a lot of scrutiny, you open up yourself to not just potential security issues, but maybe copyright as well. I'm
Yeah,
just curious.
the one catchy phrase that kind of stuck with me I read recently was just because something is out there for free doesn't mean it's free of rights. So that's
Yeah,
one thing to keep in mind.
yeah, of course. No, that's a good point. And I can see it both ways. I do see these disruptive players sometimes move the ball forward in some areas that could have been improved but have been stagnant. And there's a little bit of this break things now and then ask for forgiveness later. And sometimes there is a callous disregard into it, but sometimes some things do get into a static, calcified state, and you need someone to shake things up, and then this is going to play out. But as a security person, like, those are all things that should be top of mind. I'm curious, I would love to hear from all of you on the chat if any of these things any of the things we brought up so far, have those been questions that you asked yourselves? Are those things you wonder about? Because I wonder about those all the time. One of the things I grapple the most with is, you'll notice if you've used LLMs for some time, is the relative that they're not deterministic, right? They'll make things up every now and again, and not necessarily in a good way. And usually, if you're evaluating the work of a fellow human and something doesn't feel right, you can just ask them to explain themselves. And granted, some of us do a great job, some of us don't do a very good job, but it's usually, there's usually a way to go back and forth, and then you say, oh, okay, I can see why you thought that. And I don't know if you've tried that, but with an LLM, there's no, because it's not really thinking. And it can get quite worrisome if you're relying on that output. So you don't quite understand why it came to a conclusion like that. Now, if you have a good grasp of the subject matter, it's easy to sniff these things out and keep it honest. And then it'll help you be productive. So what I'm trying to say is, you can leverage it to make quick progress in work that you're doing. And if it's making stuff up, you can quickly recover from that, because you look at it and say, oh, this is not right. And you ask it to rethink its answer, so to speak. But it can't quite tell you why it came to that. Now, I have seen some instances with GPT-4 where actually it does a reasonable job. So I'll ask about something that I thought is odd, and then it'll explain the reasoning behind it. But by and large, you don't quite understand why it's coming to that conclusion, which means it's not that predictable, which means there's an element of non-determinism that I think people don't factor in enough. And just from a pure security standpoint, you don't like that kind of, you don't like gray areas, usually. You want those out of the picture. And that has a lot of implications if the folks consuming those services just shovel the output and then push that into your systems. And one of the first rules especially in application security is you don't just trust any input. You want to carry out a certain level of input validation. The challenge here becomes is the rate at which you like based on the integration you have with these tools, you may be ingesting this stuff at a very high rate. And if things are engineered in such a way where you're shoveling this output and straight into your own systems, then you open yourself up to potential safety issues there as far as the security of your platform is concerned. Anything to add there, Saad?
No, sorry, I was watching the chat and working there.
That's probably more interesting. That's fine. I don't blame you. But I hope someone was listening to me. Actually, let me read because I asked a question. Maybe I'll have a chance to see what folks said. Robert's asking if there are good summaries of the risks. That's a great question. And I will say that one of the things we like one of our goals for our course is for people to be able to generate such a list themselves. This shouldn't be too difficult, really. If you digest the sort of the mindset we're trying to instill, and we do talk about security primitives, which are things you want to see for the various layers of your infrastructure or your systems, then yes, you should be able to generate this. The thing I don't personally, I'm not a huge fan when it comes to just checklists is people then focus too much on checking off the lists and there may be things in those lists that, excuse me, the lists may be missing things that apply to you, but not to others. But because it's a list and it's catering to everyone, you're going to miss things that are relevant to your context. But it would be good to devise something like that. Yeah. Indemnity.
I think one of the questions to circle back on is, so how does ChatGPT or whatever large learning model that you're using, how does that relate to security fundamentals and basics in that sense? Why do I care about knowing those fundamentals? And can I just get an LLM to answer those questions for me or do that work for me? Yes, I'm asking you just for your perspective because I think that's one of the big questions around is, okay, this is abstracting away things, and so do I really need to focus on basics? Why can I just rely on one of those maybe trained language model to deal with that?
While folks are thinking of your question, Sad, I just want to add something. So, Emma, you mentioned that Copilot doesn't use any of the data, and I don't want to debate that. I just want to throw something out there, and I don't know if you'll agree with me, but I feel oftentimes the fine print is where it's at. So generally, I just don't trust the providers because sometimes also they seem to come back of what they said, and then they'll clarify, oh, we actually meant it in this instance, but not that one. And yes, it's true, we don't look at this portion, but we look at that. I usually just take a very conservative approach, and that's just me. and I'll assume the worst, and unless I really have the fine details, and then I can really look into what it is that I can tolerate or not. Because also, here's the thing, sometimes what happens is they think they're doing something that based on their statements, but turns out that lo and behold, the implementation was not perfect and there's some leakage somewhere. So you'll have to gauge what your risk tolerance is. And see, now we're framing it in terms of risk, and that's the kind of thing we also like to talk about in the course, which is to think using that type of framework. Ultimately, we're not doing security for the sake of security. We do it to support the business. And you're either building something that supports the business, or you're responsible for securing what is getting built. And your role as a security engineer or practitioner is to assess the situation from a pure technical perspective, but then inject some pragmatic insight into it to balance the risk as well as what you're functionally trying to do, rather than just saying no because you were trained that, oh, this is bad, this is good, and so this looks bad, so I'm just going to say no as a security engineer, versus say, no, let me look at this. How does this work in our context? What has our leadership said about our mission and what we're trying to accomplish? And you'll raise the concerns in a responsible manner, and then try to get some stakeholders aligned, and then you'll do what's best for the business. So thinking in terms of along those lines, one thing that is like an essential exercise there is threat modeling. And I don't know if any of you are familiar. Obviously, those of you that were in our course know that because we went through that exercise. But basically, it's this exercise of asking what can possibly go wrong with the system, or maybe with this feature that I'm about to ship. And it's not a random exercise. There's a method to the madness. There's a way to go on about it in a structured fashion. And one thing we do teach is this approach to decomposing systems into their constituent components. And that gives you a basis of then how to go on about threat modeling. Because once you decompose the system into the four main areas that we see all infrastructure and all useful systems fall into, then you can focus on each layer, where we also lay out security primitives, meaning the sort of the least set of things that you want to see in place in order to have a reasonably secure computing environment. And that's how you tackle the rest of it. And AI will probably have, or rather say, an AI augmented workflow will introduce new terms, but the underlying approach doesn't really change. So it's just a question of you familiarizing yourself with, okay, what does this workflow require? What are the tools required? Whatever, all of that stuff. And then you just move on to doing the basic threat model, which you should have no problem with. Similar to when data science started taking off, and now you had a whole ecosystem of tools around that. And there was a little bit of a lag before security practitioners caught up with what was going on, but eventually it happened. But the underlying basics don't really change. Do you agree, Sar? Is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that kind of goes back to the whole just sticking with the principles, because I think the one thing you notice most of the time, and again, I don't want to generalize too much, but a lot of the security incidents, if you really go back to the root cause of them, or just someone missed something very basic. It's not now, of course, you have state actors and targeted attacks and all that, and that's a bit at a different level. But generally, it's very basic. Someone forgot to set up permissions on an S3 bucket where a lot of the data is stored, and that got leaked. So going back to those foundational or fundamental aspects of security and checking those boxes in that sense is the way to go. And can AI help you in some of that? Sure. It's again, like we talked about, it's a tool that I'm sure it can help you, but you got to know what to look for and where to look for it. and then ChatGPT or whatever else can help you with that. And just to go back a bit, Copilot, the one pattern I've seen with a lot of the new products is they're not just specifically for Copilot. They have they have different plans, but usually you have an individual plan and maybe an enterprise level plan or whatever other plan. And usually they give themselves a bit more leeway in the individual plan, and thus it might be cheaper or free. And so again, free is never really free. So maybe enterprise plans, they don't really use your data, but the individual level plan might use some of it. So again, read the fine print because a lot of that stuff can be found there.
So I think we're at the half-hour mark. We were slated for 30 minutes. I just want to recap with 3 things that we touched upon in terms of the challenges that AI introduces into your life as a security practitioner. The first one, and I mentioned that, is the lack of determinism or the predictability in the output. The second is data governance, and we did talk about that, things related to copyright and whatnot, but that's the point. Oh, Chris has sessions 45. Okay, great. We're usually always late. That's why I'm paranoid about we usually go over. Okay, great. But this is a good time to recap those things. So data governance is definitely a challenge. Not just what you're consuming, but also where your data is going. Is it going to get used in training? And what does that mean? Is this only for a specific model that you consume, or might this go into models that other people are looking at, right? And there was a well-publicized incident with OpenAI early on, and I don't know if it was Samsung or I forgot the company, but basically some engineers were using it to assist in writing code, and there were obviously what's fairly common is someone's working on a problem they have, and they'll just dump the code they have and say, hey, I'm trying to do this with this code. What do you suggest, or whatever? And then that code showed up somewhere else, someone else using the service. So data governance is a challenge. And it used to be, I would say, a walk in the park before LLMs. Of course, it was never a walk in the park, but compared to now, it's a serious thing. Very similar to what corporate security teams went through with the rise of shadow IT, right? Prior to cloud services, corporate security had a much easier job. They would lock down the corporate machines. All of the services that employees used were on premise. It was all in-house, end of story. And then you had Dropbox, you had Box, you had all sorts of things. You had legitimate things like Salesforce, where now a ton of enterprise data was now in cloud services, some sanctioned, some not sanctioned. And so I feel this is already a little bit of the same way. So it's opaque. And which brings me to my third point, which I think there's a fair amount of dangerously hidden complexity when using LLMs, because they abstract a lot of complexity behind that prompt or behind that API call. And so the processes that are needed to take that input of yours and generate a useful output, those processes are open to vulnerabilities as well, which necessitates the need for you to treat the output with extreme care and not just funnel it into another system without the necessary validations. So 3 things really that we focused on today. Like I said, the lack of determinism, the challenges with data governance, and the hidden complexity there, and the need to treat this as another element in your supply chain, albeit it might be very tightly integrated based on your use case. Saad, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, no, I just saw Robert had a question about but what specifically are the most important areas that should someone look for at the starting point? And I think sticking to fundamentals or foundations of security is you have to first understand what the system is, how it's implemented, how it's configured, how it's operated. And once you have a basic and foundational understanding of that system, then you can start working on securing it and from a best practices standpoint and basic principles again. Now, for security, there are layers. Sure, you can start at the bottom and it gets more complicated depending on what your risk is. But a good start would be our course. We go through the discovery phase, how to look at the system, how to break it down into the different components, just get a better understanding of it. And then we walk you through some of the examples of how to actually secure some of this stuff and how to think about securing or what questions to ask when you try to secure a system. So I think whether it's, I'm not going to say whether it's our course or someone else's, because I'd love to see you in our course, but yeah, at least starting from basic principles and basic understandings, I don't think there's a replacement for that. Now, you can use an LLM model to help you understand some of the stuff, but again, you got to know what you're looking at and deeply understand some of this stuff before you can secure it.
Yeah, I'll just, Robert, I'll add in terms of what are the most important areas. If I had to start really, the first thing would be to understand my specific use case. What is it that we're using it for? Sometimes you'll just quickly see that it's not an area that involves any sensitive material. In this case, the pressure there is immediately alleviated. It doesn't mean we just turn a blind eye, but sometimes just by starting there, that it can really tell you where you need to go versus, oh, we're planning on using this to assist with code, and some of that code, for example, may make it into our, I don't know, our authentication libraries, like something really serious, right? That's where I would start. I would like to understand the use case, and then from there you can quickly get into the details. Not something we can quickly cover here, but as we said, we love to emphasize the basics because the individual use cases tend to vary, and we believe that if you have a good grasp on the fundamentals, then you could build on that to get to wherever you want without us necessarily telling you in a detailed way how to do that. Emma has had some great input there. I just wanted to point that out. And it's definitely stuff that gets to the details of using LLMs. But we're also trying to emphasize how to look at it as a black box, because sometimes you have to, and what are the considerations you would have. But if you're further along the journey, and Emma, I would say, is probably definitely one of those people, then there's a lot of good input she has there on this. Subbu, I didn't get the question. Security info, any? I think
it sounded like maybe filtering your
yeah, I
JSON
think
before
so.
sending.
Yeah, and I agree. There's going to be a lot of interesting stuff that arises there. There's definitely lots of needs around that, and I think the industry is just, I don't know if it's even started to catch up yet. I think everyone's trying to make sense of how the stuff is getting used. And in fact, I just wanted to mention something that today we're talking about LLMs and AI, but we actually will be showcasing how it can be used by security practitioners, and we will do that in the in the upcoming run of the course, actually, to show how it could be a useful tool to highlight where the limitations that we see and how you can still benefit from it. It can be a decent boost to your productivity, and in fact, we argue it can really help beginners as a learning tool as well. There's a lot of security tasks that can be sped up not fully automated, right? If you recall, you do need to supervise and scrutinize what it is that you're getting out of it. But that is something we will get to. So Subbu, yeah, I expect there to be lots of things that will be needed, and that eventually some of the more entrepreneurial minds will definitely get to that.
And on a side note, I just noticed Jessica and Carl, it's great to see you. We're not seeing you, but it's nice to have you, and thanks for joining. It's been a while. Hope you've had a good summer and fall so far.
Yeah, Jessica and Carl, if you want to sign up for the course again, I know Wael and Sar said there are updates. I'm kidding, but also it was so fun to have you in the last run.
Carl moved. Okay.
Awesome.
Good luck with the FDA approvals.
Everyone, we are at time. So thank you so much for joining us today for this Hype Meets Reality webinar. I will drop the link to the Security Foundations for Engineering course in the Zoom chat, which I just did. So please sign up. And I can confirm, as somebody who course managed the course last time, it is extremely fun and interactive and informative. Please join us in the next round of this course starting mid-January next year. And I hope to see you all there.
And thank you all for making the time today.
Jessica can confirm, as someone who attended it, that it's great. Awesome. See you all there. And thank you, Wael and Sar, for taking the time to share all this knowledge with us today.
Pleasure.
Thanks
all.
Bye all.
Bye. Have a good one.
Bye.